In this unit, we'll be discussing intervals. The word interval refers to any sort of musical distance. It could be between rhythms, it can be between any two events on a score, but most often the word interval refers to the distance between two pitches. There are two types of intervals. There's melodic intervals, which refers to sort of a more horizontal phenomenon. As shown at left, every single pair of notes in this melody has an interval, and the first three are shown by brackets. There is some sort of distance from the first C to the second C. There's some distance for the second bracket from this C to the next B, and there's a distance in the second bar from this B to G. And again, we say this is more of a horizontal event as one pitch follows another. Melodic intervals are referred to as having both a direction and a distance. So from the first C to the second C, we describe whether it's upward or downward motion. And based on our previous discussions of pitch, we know that on the very staff itself, that the motion towards the top of the page implies upward motion in pitch. That C goes up to the higher C. So moving to the next pair, the C to the B over the bar line is going down, and it is also moving downward towards the bottom of the page. And in the third bracket, this B to G motion is also a motion downward in pitch. The intervals are also described as having various sizes, and in a moment we'll discuss a means for talking about specific distance between the notes. But for now, we can just say that there's a wider leap in that first interval, and it's harder to sing. And there are smaller leaps that are smaller distances that follow, and those more conjunct motion and the pitches are closer together. The intervals, we'll say, are smaller. The other type of interval shown on this page are harmonic intervals, and this can be thought of as a more vertical sort of phenomenon. The C and the E are sounded together simultaneously. And there is a distance between them, but it's hard to say, it's quite impossible to say, whether it's an upward or downward interval. We can't say the C is moving up to E, and we can't say the E is moving down to C because they happen at the same time. So a harmonic interval does not have a direction, it only has a distance. There's a certain interval here between those first two notes. There's another type of interval shown in the second bracket between this D and F sharp. Sorry, that's the interval. You'll have to excuse my slightly out of tune piano. The third interval, even though it doesn't have a bracket, is between B and C, and you'll note it has a quite striking sound. And now on to the issue of specific size. Intervals are measured by counting letter names, and we say that we count them inclusively. So if you recall the interval we were just discussing, or one of them on the previous page, we had a C and an E. To describe the actual distance involved, we just count the letter names of all the notes that span the distance from C to E. In this case, it's 1, 2, 3 notes, and C to E is referred to as being the interval of a third. If I wanted to discuss the interval between a C to a G, or play them together as a harmonic interval, the distance is calculated by just counting the letter names. C, D, E, F, G is 5 letter names. This is a fifth. If I was going to go from an E up to perhaps the C above it, we would count 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 letter names, and we would be dealing with a sixth as the interval size. We can now do some practice with this. We have our melody from before, and between every pair of pitches there will be some sort of directed interval. At this point, it would be a good idea to pause the recording and copy out this music and try your hand at labeling the intervals, both in terms of their direction and their distance by counting letter names. You can use the little scale at the bottom as a reminder of how many notes are included or how the counting will go. If you've done that, we can now check your work. We'll consider each interval in turn. The first goes from C to C. We've already described this as being a wide interval and as being an upward interval, but we haven't actually talked about what number it gets. And we could count from C up to C, and we would get 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. And indeed, this is a ascending octave. Or we could just have remembered from before that C and C are the same letter name, and they always have an octave relationship. So there are two methods to make your way around interval calculations. You can always count letter names, or you can have reference points knowing that C and C are the same note. So obviously you're dealing with an octave, and the information is the same no matter which direction or sort of which method you use. Moving on, the next interval goes between C and B. Well, C and B are right next to each other on our sort of our spectrum of notes, and it involves 1, 2 letter names, and this is a downward second, C to B. The motion from B to G, you can even see in the note heads is a little bit of a bigger gap, and going from a B towards a G in the downward direction involves B, A, G, 3 letter names, and that's a descending third. So we have so far an ascending octave, a step or a second, and then down a third. At this point, the music reverses course and starts heading upward, and GA is a second, AB is a second, and BC is a second. We could do some harmonic interval practice as well. And one thing I'll comment about in this graphic is that there are some accidentals which will change the expected white notes to being sort of a black note next to the G or A or B that you're expecting. So the first pair of notes is E and G sharp, but remarkably for our interval calculations, the accidentals, the presence of sharps or flats, means nothing. We're still going to rely on the same letter name counting. So to get from an E to any kind of G, whether it's G sharp or anything, involves E, F, and G, it is still a third. If depending on what kind of G, it would be a different quality third, but all E's to G's are thirds, and this indeed is a third. The interval from this B flat to this A flat means I'm just playing the black notes below B and A. Right? And you can see it's sort of a wider span. The notes are a little further apart, and of course they're also on different staves. But to calculate the interval, we'll just start at any B. We could start at this B, or at this, we'll start at this B. And because we don't have an A on the end here, although there's one implied, it goes on forever. But starting at the very lowest end, from this B, to get to the A, we'd have to go 1, 2, 3, my mouse is disappearing, 4, 5, 6, 7 notes, and it's the seventh. There is another way to get the interval, which is to realize going from B to B would be an octave, and this is one note less than that. So you would also be able to gauge the distance of a seventh in that way. The last thing we'll say in this first lecture about intervals is that there's a system to simplify large intervals, which will make everybody's lives easier in this course, and in fact most musicians rely on this shorthand. We talk about intervals as being compound when they get large, and I'll explain how this happens. So at the far left of this example we see some pretty small intervals. Second, third, this is an out of tune fourth, fifth, sixth, seventh, octave. So those are the intervals we're familiar with. If we kept going, technically this C to D involves 9 notes and is a ninth, and the C to E involves 10 notes and is a tenth. And you will hear musicians on occasion referring to larger spans and larger distances by these names, ninths, 11ths, 13ths, 23rds. It's all possible. But often we rely on a shorthand which says that the sound of this C to D, which is technically a ninth, involves 9 note names, sounds an awful lot like this C to D. Right? It's a C to D with a C below and a D above. And in this case, we're going to say that this ninth is really like a second with an octave sort of expansion. So the term we'll use is to say that this is some kind of expanded second. C to D here, second. This kind of C to D is also basically a second. Let's say going over here from C to G, if we count upwards in letter names C, D, E, F, G, we get that sound, and we'll call that a compound fifth. But essentially the quality of fifthness is still present, even though the interval is quite larger than a fifth. So all of the octaves that are beyond this number, usually reduced down to some kind of second, third, fourth, fifth, sixth, or seventh.